All right. Well, I am very excited today. I've got an old friend in the house here, Matt Zolfo of Professional Transition Strategies. Matt, thanks for joining me today. It's so great to see you. Happy 21, and tell us a little bit about what you're doing now.
Thanks so much, Nick. I appreciate it, man. Great seeing you as well. You've always been a great friend, and Five Lakes has always been just astounding to work with. So back in 2020, I joined Professional Transition Strategies. Our founder and president, Kyle Francis, is an old Baylor buddy of mine from back in the day. He and I actually knew each other in college, and I started at Henry Schein in '04. He started at Henry Schein in '05. So not only were we friends, but also partners in crime at Schein, and during our time there, obviously seeded a variety of different dental offices. So I resigned from Schein a couple years ago and went and kind of did the startup thing. And Kyle called through COVID, and we kind of buddied up again and talked to him and some other folks at the firm, and joined the M&A world in terms of private equity, DSO, and investment bank roll-ups. So we are kind of a mid-market transaction firm that still deal with individual buyers and individual sellers, but predominantly transact multi-doctor practices or multi-location practices, or small groups of private dentists that want to bolt on or join larger groups in terms of economies of scale and things of that nature. So it's been fun.
So I feel like you're getting into, this space at a great time. I mean, obviously you've been involved in dentistry forever, and you've seen not only startups, but you've seen acquisitions, and you've been partner to practices growing. And so you've seen them at all life cycles. There's so much consolidation going on. There's so much buying and selling with the demographics of doctors. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing out there, in the market right now.
Yeah, gladly. Well, consolidation is obviously something that has been accelerating, I would say, over the past 5 to 7 years. You had really big brands probably 10 to 15 years ago that came in and bought, started buying up practices or doing de novos for large organized forms of dentistry. And I would say 10 to 15 years ago, what I always say is DSO is either a 3-letter acronym or a 4-letter word, depending on who you talk to. Everybody has different opinions in regards to how that process goes and what their opinions of, I'll call it, quote, organized dentistry is. But just like there's good lawyers and bad lawyers, and good accountants and bad accountants, and good dentists and not so good dentists, there's also good DSOs and PE firms, and there's, bad DSOs and bad PE firms. So what's largely been happening in the industry is, certainly as of 2019, 2020, there's more capital being put to work in this sector of healthcare than there are practices to transact. So invariably, that's driven up the, call it sell side terms. On top of that, the majority of the practices that do transact, even if you were to sum up all of the, call it, M&A brokerage houses in the country, there's really only 3 or 4 that do transactions in, call it, the 3 to 5 to 15 to 20 million range. Even if you summed up all of the practices that transact through a brokerage, we're still only getting access to about 25, maybe 30% of what's being acquired in the marketplace. So invariably, a lot of these PE firms or DSOs are going directly to the doctor and giving them one offer and one fit for their organization. Whereas on our side, there's a lot of options out there. So we try and garnish interest, narrow down options in terms of fit for the client, and what that doctor's looking to do, whether it's work 10, 15 more years, or whether it's work 1 or 2 more years, and also match up a culture that's a good fit for them. So it's been fun.
I feel like that's a really important distinction, because to me, if I'm starting to walk down the path of selling, like you said, I mean, they're probably getting phone calls every day.
Yep.
And how do I start to weed out or weed through, all those different things, right? I mean, there's so many components to a transition, and there's so much emotional attachment to the practice and what you've built. Walk me through, we were talking a couple weeks back about EBITDA. Like, walk me through what you guys are looking for in a practice that would give you kind of a baseline to say, okay, yeah, these guys are maybe ready to sell, or they're they're strong fundamentally, and so we know that they can succeed when they partner up with somebody. What does that whole process look for you guys?
Yeah, gladly. So, we approach dentists very much the way that dentists approach dealing with patients. I mean, if a patient comes in pain, they basically have a multitude of options, right? You can pull the tooth, you can, do a root canal, or, doing nothing is an option, right? And it's very important to make clear from the get-go is, doing nothing is definitely an option. So what we try and do is present the client with information. We do a prospectus at no charge, pull some reports out of the practice management software, look at tax returns, look at the P&L. We have an in-house CPA that does that for us. She's done a little over 2,000 prospectuses over the last, call it 10 to 12 years. And then Kyle, our president's transacted almost 400 businesses, not locations, but businesses with business owners. So, it's really important that the client know that, the beginning stages is really just the information gathering process. In terms of what gets listed, we have a buyer pool of a little over 1,800 to 1,900 buyers across the country, and that ranges from private individual buyers that are looking for one other practice, all the way up to the largest PE firms in the country and the largest DSOs in the country. So from a sell side, we usually we're a sell side brokerage, but B, that doctor, normally our core client is either maybe, looking to either grow the business or wants some help with marketing or wants some help with the team, HR and staffing, or wants some help with compliance or wants some help with operational expenses, be it lab bill or dental supplies. The advantages of dealing with some form of quote organized dentistry is you're taking those economies of scale and bolting your business onto some work and some help of a lot of these other entities and a lot of these other people that have done this multiple times for be it 10, 15, 30, in some cases over 100 locations. So it's really a blend of making sure that A, the client is willing to relinquish some of that control, and B, wants the help to do that.
I think that's such a great point, if I can interrupt you for a second, because I think when I start thinking about doctors that want to sell, I think about doctors who are maybe approaching retirement, right?
Yep.
And really what you just said was about wanting help. And I think that's such a mature approach to running the business aspect, right? Because that's oftentimes where people maybe don't like to be involved, or they get in a little over their heads because they don't have that formal education in business. That's a really interesting point. So would you say that a lot of times it's doctors that are looking for specific help in running the business aspect of their practice?
Yeah, no question. And, if you peel back the curtain at PTS, we're a 100% Salesforce driven organization. So we track a lot of data. This isn't exactly accurate, but it'll make the point. Our average client, instead of being 74, is more like 47, right? So we're dealing with folks that maybe have had 1 or 2 or 3 offices or 1 large practice and want to de-risk their investment and get some help at running the operation of the business. That doesn't mean the name on the door changes. That doesn't mean the team changes at all. If anything, it should be a win-win-win for everyone involved, and the patients should never know the difference. Just basic things like, to your point, insurance verification, or, looking at a P&L monthly and having another set of eyes on it. Or again, lab fees, dental supply costs, staffing, adding an associate. I'm dealing with a couple dentists right now that have, 1 large practice, maybe an associate. They're doing somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million, and their goal is to go do 2 more locations. Well, instead of, going to get a loan and trying to find, a dentist that'll associate in these 2 other offices, that may take a year to a year and a half to 2 years. In this case, a dentist would have the opportunity to bring on a capital partner, and use their access to capital and the operational systems that may be in place with some form of organized dentistry to achieve the exact same goal, with the same, if not a higher level of return in terms of total profitability.
That's really interesting, because so what you're challenging the doctor then is to figure out like what you really want, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, building a house or buying a house or, starting a business is obviously a lengthy process, but that really has to start with the core of, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, but, per se, what that person wants to be when they grow up. So I say that tongue in cheek, obviously, with all due respect, but, But yeah, it really depends on the desires of the client and kind of, what their goals are, be it more time with their family or, wanting to take more vacation. It's hard to do that when you're the business owner wearing 7 different hats: HR, the clinician physically doing the majority of the production in the, in the office, payroll, and all the other things affiliated with, running a small business. A lot of people have this perception that if they were to transact with a small group or a large group of private equity, that, all of a sudden they lose complete control of the practice and autonomy of the practice. And that's just no longer the case. That was the case 10 to 15 years ago. But if you look at it from the private equity side or a hedge fund side or a bank side, the last thing they would want to do is upset the apple cart and disrupt the patient base. So the goal is for the patients not to know anything other than, things are running maybe a little bit more smoothly or a little bit more on time or a little bit more efficiently than they were in times past.
Yeah, that's such a good point. The perception, I think, is that, oh man, if I sell, I'm out 100%, I'm selling out completely and I'm just an employee and I lose control of everything.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things built into a transaction that A, mutually align the goals, and B, give everyone skin in the game to grow, including the team. This affects, more than just the doctor, but there are things that, are usually written into a business transaction of this nature, like an earn up or an earn in for more equity in the entity, in the event, EBITDA grows or the practice profitability grows, or the top line collections grow. So it just, if it's a PPO practice or if it's fee for service practice, anyone that's, investing in this dentist certainly doesn't want, anything to change drastically, because that will obviously affect the profitability of their investment. Everyone's doing this for a return, the dentist, of course, the owning dentist, and also the entity that wants to grow that and go do that for other practices and eventually, turn that to another capital partner.
So what's more important? Is it profit margin or EBITDA, like the sheer dollar number?
So EBITDA is probably the, I won't say the most important thing, but financially, if you look at any investment or any business, you want to know, if you picture a small business as a machine, you want to know what that machine is pumping out annually in terms of profitability. And
that's when you remove the doctor's salary and things like that too, right?
Correct. So basically, after all the bills have been paid, once you've calculated a quote fair market wage for the dentist, a lot of times 30% of collections or for production or collections for the dentist or associate, and then in a specialty case, in some cases 33 to 35%. If it's a specialty practice, you want to know effectively what that business has left over, annually, and you can equate that to a value, and then there's a multiple assigned to that when the practice transacts.
And how have multiples changed, or have they changed at all, given what's happened with in 2020 and coming in 21? What does that look like now?
Great question. So, first of all, I'll address COVID. Everybody on the planet shut down for at least 2 months, if not longer, based on the area of the country that we were in. And transactions slowed. At least at our firm, we were equally on par with where we were last year, if not a little bit more. 2021 is going to be even better. In terms of multiples, those are going to range based on a variety of different things. One thing I will note is when I started in the industry almost 16, 17 years ago, the standard quote, transaction for an acquisition was, on the low end, 65 to 75% of collections plus assets, and that's what the business sold for. So if it was $1 million practice, you're looking to get 700 to 750,000 out of it. That's just not the case anymore. Like I said, there's more capital being put to work in this space than there are practices to transact. So the healthier the practice, the higher the multiple is going to be. The unhealthier the practice, the lower the multiple is going to be. The other big thing that drives that multiple is if you were to plop a practice, in the middle of a cornfield in Kansas, where, you'd have to drive 100 miles to get to the next dentist, it'd be very difficult in terms of desirability to get a business or, an associate to operate in that entity. Whereas if you plop it in San Diego or Seattle or, in my opinion, Dallas, Texas, it might be a little bit more attractive in terms of the number of people or what people would be willing to pay for that. So invariably that drives up that multiple range. But most of what we're seeing now, if there's an organized buyer involved, the practice is going for over collection. So on that $1 million case, you'd be going north of $1 million.
It's interesting. So you're talking about attracting a doctor to a location, because when I think of practices, generally when it's more rural, I tend to think of them as involved with less insurance. I think of them as generally a little bit bigger because they are the center. They're pulling people in from 25, 50 miles out. And I feel like they're financially very successful, because when you look at the disparities for access to care, there's always access to care issues when you go out into more rural areas. But like you said, then getting somebody maybe to replace a doctor who grew up in that town or committed to that town, it might be more difficult to get somebody who's 23 to come and live. And
yeah, and I don't want to confuse, call it enterprise value or transacted value of the business with interest. We've got listings in the Panhandle of Texas right now, in Wyoming, in Arkansas, in a variety of different rural areas. There are definitely interested parties that want those practices because they are usually larger and, have, stereotypically, a heightened level of relationship within the community because there are fewer providers there that draw from a larger sphere of influence, call it, 8 to 10 to 15 to 20 miles versus in a major metropolitan area, 2 to 4 miles, right?
Right.
So there's definitely an interest in people acquiring those practices or bolting onto an organization that can streamline operations. But the actual multiple of what that would transact at might be different than a more desirable major metropolitan area.
Yeah, it's interesting how those types of things, factor into the equation. What about the differences? I mean, obviously we work with insurance. Is there any difference in valuation from a fee-for-service practice compared to a insured practice that's heavy with PPOs?
Not necessarily. I mean, it really is a function of the top line collections and then the EBITDA that's left over. Again, once everybody's paid a fair wage and all the expenses have been calculated, that is a gauge of the health or the profitability of the business. Obviously, the larger the top line in dentistry, 80% of the costs on a P&L are fixed. The only two variable things are the 15 to 20%. Or 12 to 20%, which would be dental supplies and lab fees. So in theory, the higher the collections, the more profitable the practice. However, whether it's PPO or fee for service, a lot of that's going to transact similarly in terms of multiple. You'll see people tend to shy away from stereotypically Medicaid or managed care practices, mainly because there's inherent risk there. You're at the mercy of the healthcare system to determine reimbursement rates. However, there are a variety of different buyers we've dealt with across the country that have built a portfolio of that or hedged a portfolio with those types of practices. So it's probably the wrong term to use, but one man's trash is another man's treasure. That's the benefit of dealing with a brokerage like ours, is really involving a multitude of people, really to find the best fit for that doctor in terms of the long run, be it in terms of time horizon of how long they want to work and what they want help with, and certainly culture, but also de-risking their investment or taking some money out of the practice in terms of equity to go do other things in life.
So how, and I think about this too. So we have a lot of clients who are groups, DSOs, and you mentioned you have a large buyer pool. I almost picture this like a dating site, right? Like find the right DSO, right? Like how do you go in and look at like culture and the funding mechanism and where you can retain control, or like you could put these little variables in, like I like cooking and blah blah blah, right?
Yeah.
Find the right partner. How do you guys do that?
Great question. I mean, the foundation of any business relationship starts with trust first and foremost. So A, you probably need to like who you're working with, and B, you need to trust who you're working with. No different than who you build a dental office with. I used to tell people back when I was selling equipment and technology and design and practices, listen, I may not be your best fit. Go see what's out there, but certainly whoever you're dealing with needs to be adding value to this process, and you ending up in a better place on the back end of that. So from a buyer standpoint, like I mentioned, we use Salesforce. We require the majority of our buyers, certainly organized buyers, to fill out a buyer profile, which gives us an idea of, where the capital's coming from, B, what areas of the country they're interested in, and C, if they could wave a magic wand, kind of their perfect quote unquote practice.
Mhm.
So effectively, once we get a listing, we'll, put that out in various channels, and market the practice through our marketing coordinator. But most of that goes directly to entities that have said, hey, I'm looking for a practice in Denver, or hey, I'm looking for a practice in Chicago, or hey, I'm looking for a practice in LA. And stereotypically, you'll see those buyers inquire in those areas regularly. So once we've garnered interest and gathered a gauge in terms of what the interest to the practice is, I usually go back directly to the client and say, okay, here's the profile of people that we found are interested in what you have to offer. Let's revisit our original conversation as to why you went into this process anyways. Has anything changed? Where do you see yourself a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and who would you like us to liaise pursuing in terms of an interview of sorts. And at that point, it's really just being a liaison to connect these two people to get to know each other, whether that's a private buyer or whether that's a private equity firm or a DSO, and then they really take it from there.
Yeah, like how many times are you in a situation where you have multiple interested parties, and there's like I think of it like selling a house almost, where you're like, oh, there's got 3 offers or something like that, right? Is that a lot?
Yeah, no question. We do a variety of different prospectuses per month. That ranges, somewhere between 20 to 50. And most of the people that do a prospectus with us end up entering into a listing agreement, mainly because our listing agreement's only 30 days. We don't like contracts. I don't like them with cell phones. I don't like them with AT&T, my internet provider. So our thought is, if we can't garnish activity or gather activity rather within the first 30 days and present that to you to let you see what the market would bear for, what your practice is worth in terms of tangible interest, we don't deserve to have your business. So it's very common that we get multiple inquiries on a practice. In terms of interviews and tours and things of that nature, we like to kind of, not really waste anybody's time, our client or certainly the buyer. So we do a pretty good job at, communicating back and forth for, call it somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks to narrow down who's really interested and that the goals align. And most of those interviews usually translate over to a letter of intent to buy the business. At that point, we do an analysis for the client in terms of, cash value at close, earn ups, earn ins, the equity value, anticipated transaction down the road in terms of some form of equity roll, and then present an enterprise value to them. And very, very rarely who we think the doctor is going to like is what ends up being their decision. So no way, shape, or form do we lead the witness. No different than, if a patient were in a chair, a dentist wouldn't say, an implant's really the only way to go. We don't want to do a bridge. We want to do an extraction. And you certainly want to do something today. Let's definitely do the implant. It very rarely pans out that way. It's more of kind of a give and take and making sure that the goals align.
So you said this, it made me think, how do you handle this with staff? So let's say I'm interested in finding a partner for my practice, and but I obviously I don't want to get the team all worked up. Well, how does that work?
Well, obviously, you're going to want to keep things as close to the vest you can as an owner as possible, because again, doing nothing's still an option, and you may choose to, once you see the offers or see what's out there, you may choose to bolster up the practice for another 2 or 3 or 5 years. And, frankly, in most cases, the most profitable thing for the owner to do in the short term is continue to run their business. If you've got, $1 million practice with 65% overhead and 350 of that's going back to the doctor annually, again, back to the machine point, whatever EBITDA is pumping out that you're taking advantage of now, you definitely want to continue to utilize. However, if you do end up transacting, back to my original point, this is an investment for a DSO or for a PE firm, and they're buying it to grow it or to keep it exactly the same and garnish some of the profit, from the owner in that case. So very, very rarely is someone going to come in and change the pay structure of the team. If anything, it'll be enhanced. Everybody will have more benefits than he did before. Right. And everybody will have maybe an option at a bonus pool or an option at paid time off that's earned in over time. Things that normally, you'd get through a larger entity that are hard for a small business owner. A great example, 401k in healthcare. It's expensive for an owner to pay for that. But once you get north of 100, 200, 300 employees, that just becomes a cost of doing business. And the sum of the parts are greater, as the whole continues to grow. So there is a time after the LOI and everything is at contract that whoever the buyer is becomes involved, and the staff is made aware of that. And we certainly help the client through that process and coach them through it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So last question that kind of I working off a little list here, but as we're talking this, you bring up so many fascinating points that I kind of all over the place here. But
sure.
What do you do from a due diligence perspective? So on the seller side, because I find we oftentimes work on the buy side. And so we're working with a group that's acquiring a practice, and the amount of information that's available is so varied, right? In some circumstances, you see that they get access to the entire practice management system and they can go in and pull reports. And in others, it's like, you get some crumpled up piece of paper with some notes from the office manager. Here's what I have, right? How do you guys kind of mediate what that looks like?
Great question. I mean, it's definitely a process. There are some core things that we need, to do business per se, in terms of reporting and financial background and stuff like that. And we vet a lot of that through tax returns and through the P&L and through the practice management reports. I'll go back to Kyle, our president, has done, a little over 400 transactions over the last 12 to 15 years. He's owned practices before, bought and sold practices. And our in-house CPA, Jennifer, is just unbelievable and has worked in dental offices. So we'll have a proximity to, the health of the business at that stage. Once we get into diligence, we create a data room, and all that stuff lives in a secure data environment. And then there's an NDA NDA agreed upon between, the buyers that want interest in looking at the prospectus and that information. So if there is additional information that they want from the practice, we're obviously at the mercy of the client to get that. But in most cases, they're pretty good. They've already gone through this process before, and it's just one or two things, or it's an active patient report, or it's a production summary by provider, trying to see which doctor is doing the majority of the dentistry and stuff like that. So we certainly want to get any buying entity, whether that's a single buyer that's got an accountant helping them review the numbers, or whether it's a DSO that's got 1,000 locations across the country. Everybody needs to be provided with the opportunity to do their own independent evaluation of that. So it comes and goes in times in terms of ease of acquisition of all of that information, but it is part of the process, and it's one part of the process. So
yeah, that makes sense. Okay, good,
for sure.
Good. Well, I'm very excited for you, and I appreciate you. This is such a hot topic. I mean, everybody's talking about buying, selling practices, growing practices, consolidation in the industry, and the effects of COVID and all that stuff. So, this is really timely, and I can't wait to share this with our team and with our clients. So, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll put up on our blog and website and all your contact information.
Great. So, just either a DM on LinkedIn is fine, or if you want to, if anybody would like some help, or at least some more data or information on this process, glad to go through it. It's definitely not slowing down. I guess one thing I would close with is that, back to my original comment, DSO is either a 3-letter acronym or a 4-letter word. Dentistry, what's happening in dentistry in terms of consolidation is very similar to what happened in pharmacy 30 years ago. However, now pharmacy is 70 to 75% consolidated. Whereas dentistry right now, according to DICOMA's most recent report in 2019, is only 22% consolidated. So it's never going to be 90% corporate, 10% private. I think over the next 7 to 10 to 12 years, we'll settle in at a 50-50 or a 60-40 organized dentistry versus private dentistry. But we do have time. That pendulum will swing in time, and the industry will change to that point. But as long as the buyers continue to be clinically agnostic, and certainly with the core of not just looking at returns, but ensuring that the patient base is cared for, I think this will be a good thing versus a big, scary, fearful thing in time.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You think we're about halfway there then? Maybe a little bit less than halfway there?
Yeah, I would say a little less than halfway there. That's a great way to say it. The desires of, I don't want to get into the demographics of the industry, but I think the desires of the quote millennial or zillennial dentist is trending less towards practice ownership and more towards quality of life, quality of culture. And as that dentist pool changes and the baby boomers begin to retire, that'll largely be the providers that are serving oral care in the industry. So a couple things, may accelerate or decelerate that in time, but it's never going to be this, big organized, corporate form of oral health care. We all know dentistry in general, dental insurance rather, is an oxymoron. So everybody's got teeth. So it's certainly a great space to be in and a great profession. And it's been a really great industry to partake in.
Nice. I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you, sir.
Gladly. Appreciate the invite.
21, and we'll be in touch shortly.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Nick.
Thanks, Matt.